if you've learned anything from the history of technology, it's like the more junior people, the people who aren't brought learn in certain idioms, pick up the new ones really quickly and become so much more effective with them. And I think that's going to happen.
Hi, Deepak. Welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Hi, Jody. Nice to be here.
It's your second time in the show. We were talking about a minute ago about the fact that you had recorded an interview with Jeff back in 2016. We'll comment on that later. But your last tweet is months ago, and I'm not here to question why you've abandoned my favorite social media platform, you and several million others, which is quite obvious. But you mentioned it's actually your last tweet. There's a morning of Jeff Beck, if I'm not wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. So what do you like about Jeff Beck's music, and specifically, I guess, guitarists on guitars? Are you a guitar player yourself?
I am a really bad guitar player. The best way I play guitar is playing it through a really long reverb and echo loop chain. I'm actually I'm a synthesizer person. And I almost treat guitars as string oscillators. But since I was a child, teenager, even maybe before that, I've loved guitar playing. And Jeff Beck's always been one of my probably 3 favorite guitar players.
Who would be your top 3 then? Jeff Beck, we've got one. Rest in peace.
Steve Vai has always been my favorite. In fact, when I first moved to the US, it's 1996. I think 3 days after I landed up in university, I got a bus to a Steve Vai concert. I had never done anything else in the US at that time. I went and saw that. I've seen a couple more since then. It's tough to say who else. I think Jeff Beck and Steve Vai are probably my top 2, but I always loved Jimmy Page. I've always been a huge fan of John McLaughlin. There's a bunch of others. Guthrie Gowan. There's so many. I love good guitar players. Tough to pick one.
It's a shame, but we can't keep talking about music, which would be a great time to topic to spend time on it. But no, you actually are a long-time AWS employee. In fact, when you were interviewed by Jeff back in 2016, you already were, and you probably talked about technologies that were hot at that time in AWS. But you have been right now, very recently, named a really fancy title, which you can explain in a minute. So walk us through your career. Mention what you talked with Jeff back in the day, if you remember. I'll probably link the episode in the show notes. And most importantly, talk about how your thrilling remit and charter right now at AWS.
Yeah, no, I talked with Jeff a long time ago. So I've been at AWS for a little over 15 years now. And for most of the time, I've been involved in the compute side, which is what I talked to Jeff about. Started off on EC2, really low level on HPC and performance and how to build high performance networks and big instances on the product side. But then increasingly, I got more interested in how software is packaged and delivered. So in 2014, I started a containers organization that I ran for 9 years. And that was a lot of what we talked about then, and container orchestration and container-based delivery. For a while, for the last year and a half or so, I also ran a serverless organization. So there's things like Lambda and EventBridge, as well as things like CloudFormation and CDK. So I'd started getting super interested in the software deployment, software delivery pipeline. And I also picked up our IDE organization. That's an org that does Cloud Shell, the AWS toolkit for things like Visual Studio Code, JetBrains, and things like Cloud Shell. Sort of continuing to move up the stack, as I like to say. And about 3 months ago, we started a new organization, and our charter is in some ways somewhat bombastic, but also very simple. My org is called Next Generation Developer Experience. And as the name suggests, we're a developer experience organization. We're a bunch of folks who love making it easy for people to build and deploy and run applications in the end, especially the way they interact with AWS. That's how I like to think about it. But we all have a conviction that generative AI is going to change the way any of us interacts with software. and with AWS specifically. And that's a sort of thing we set out to do as an organization. It didn't come out of nowhere. There's a bunch of things that already started. There's a few things that are already in there. We've talked a little bit before this recording started about Code Whisperer. That's one of the teams in the organization. It predates me taking over, but it made complete sense combining the IDE because Code Whisperer is delivered through our web toolkits and etc. Along with Code Whisperer and then things like Code Catalyst and some of our sort of early efforts in delivering software in ways that are less about writing code and other ways of doing it. That's what historically would be considered LowCode and NoCode. I'm not always the biggest fan of those words, but the general idea is there's a bunch of people who aren't just sitting in an IDE and writing code and deploying it that way. They do it in different ways. And with Gen AI, I think those ways are actually going to get very, very tractable. So super interested in that as well. Yeah. So the exciting part is, and for me personally, this is the most excited I've been about how foundational a change I think we are seeing since I first did EC2 run instances in 2006. Is I think we're going to change as an industry just how people interact with software, with code, with applications, and our goal is to do that for AWS.
Okay, makes sense. So, what is it then that makes code or application delivery or software delivery so prone to be impacted in a really high way by Gen AI? What is it about Gen AI that makes it such a great technology to provide a revolutionary change to code specifically, or even pipelines as code? So everything as code, right? What is it about those two elements that are such a great match?
Yeah, I mean, for those people who got introduced to generative AI, for many folks it was through things in the creative space, like with photography, with video. We have a customer called Runway that AWS has that does text to video. That's quite fascinating. There's a bunch, you see the work that Stable Diffusion has done on text to images. The general, if you look at what generative AI does, is a well-trained model is able to infer a lot of intent and is able to deliver, give you sort of, I won't say read your mind, but if you are good at writing a prompt, it's able to take that prompt and convert that intent into something. And if it's been trained on code, which things like Code Whisperer are, so it understands the semantics of code, it's able to convert your intent into well understood code. Now, if your model is trained well, it's got good corpus behind it, it works really well. But what makes it super interesting over time, and I think this is what makes it so fascinating, is I think you can always give these prompts and these models great context. For example, what your account credentials are, which AWS APIs you may want to use if your prompts are written well. And I think that's the part that makes it super fascinating is you take intent and context together, and a well-trained model can then generate code or something else. In this case, you're talking about code that is a manifestation of that in how it understands that intent and that context. And what generative AI has proved, and it's super early. I mean, it's kind of fascinating how quickly this timeline has gone. Is that given good intent and good context, you can get really good results. And as we get better at understanding intent and context, we're only going to get better. And I think that's the part that fascinates a bunch of us, and why you're starting to see so much interest in things like Code Whisperer.
Yeah, because not everything on a day-to-day, on the everyday life of a developer is actually writing code, right? And suggesting and requesting code completions and requesting suggestions of code but actually looking up stuff, right? Finding there's so many real-world examples of acquiring a new code base. Is it documented?
Yeah.
What the hell is this? How do I find my way through, or even in my own code base? How do I look up an item? Where is what is this module about? What does it do, and how should I call it? What are the coding guidelines of the company? I'm a newcomer, I'm a newbie, a new hire, and I need to be onboarded into the code base, the company, the best practices, and so forth. So there's a ton of development heavy activities that are prone to be like revolutionized right now. I mean, code suggestions have been important in IDEs for a while. They're probably going to be getting much better. But yeah, there's a whole range of activities that I think you were hinting at right now. Asking, there's this natural language way of interfacing and reacting to things that is going to be, it's going to enrich so many different activities in the day-to-day life of a developer, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we are, as you've probably heard us say, we are 3 kilometers into a marathon or 10K race. So pick your distance. It's early, but you can already see the signs, whether it's the sort of natural language conversational interfaces that you have, whether it's the fact that, there's 2 or 3 areas where I think generative AI is going to make a significant impact. One of them is just eliminating toil. There's a bunch of things that people don't like doing. And the fact that you can get that done very quickly is going to help you do more. There's the code completion part, which, as you said, has been around in IDEs for a long time. But in general, the IDE code completion was limited to language semantics. And with things like Code Whisperer, which has deep understanding of the AWS API, for example, it's more than that. It can, you can tell it in natural language, hey, I want a method that does X with an S3 bucket. It's not just about getting the syntax right. It's actually about giving it the code block and calling the right, if you're writing Java code, the right libraries from the SDK, etc., to complete that. And this is just the beginning. There's so much more we can do over time around helping people understand what the code is saying. You already mentioned things like learning the code base much faster, and so on. So I think that it's what makes it fascinating is it's already helpful because it is essentially providing you a documentation on the fly without having to actually look at the documentation and become an expert or then look at every method. But at the same time, you can also see where it could go. And so if you combine the two, I think that's where I see a lot of developers getting excited, because in some ways today, yes, it's super helpful, but it's an incremental improvement on what they were doing, especially for more experienced developers. But I think where it really starts making an impact is for people who are less experienced, and the experienced developers can see that if they commit to this now, there's a path that's going to happen really quickly that is going to make a huge impact to them as well. And I think that's where I see all the excitement.
Yeah, and I think that is going to release a lot of productivity because, as you say, the amount of oversight, companionship, training, that pair programming that the average junior developer does require currently from senior developers, and will be taken over by a code whisperer, will obviously make the on-ramp, well, not obviously, but it seems that it's going to make the on-ramp, the onboarding much faster of these junior developers. But it's also releasing senior developers, we all know that they are the 10x developers of the company, right, of the project. And it's going to release so much time from them. From not only from onboarding new junior developers, but I'm thinking of code reviews and all the different activities.
Yeah,
that it's going to let them contribute to the project much more and so forth. So I can only agree with you. Like it's going to be terrific in many areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my favorite sites always has been when new developers join the company straight out of college. Senior developers will often sit next to them. They'll either pair program with them or explain certain idioms, etc., as they're helping them onboard to the way code is built here. I think what it does is the things that they now are going to talk to them about are going to change to much more high-value things. And then they can focus on hard problems, on educating about how do you think about building a system, things like that, where it's tough to beat senior developer, but the AI assistants, as you may call them, essentially it's like giving, the way I like to say it is, it's giving the junior developer 2 partners. One is a senior developer who's going to help them through hard problems, and one is the AI assistant that's going to help them onboard quickly, help them get much more write code much faster. If you've learned anything from the history of technology, it's like the more junior people, the people who aren't brought to learn in certain idioms, pick up the new ones really quickly and become so much more effective with them. And I think that's going to happen.
And obviously, there's certain aspects that we are not factoring in, known in this conversation, but in general, it's like there are grumpy senior developers. And me as a junior developer, I've been hesitant to tap their shoulder more than twice for maybe the same question because I'm very junior and I'm learning. You know what? Code Whisperer does not get upset if you ask him or her or it the same question every time, or variations, slight variations of the same question every time, because it's got infinite patience and a strong compute behind. So yeah, code suggested. So code throughput. It's clear that the amount of volume that the amount of code that Code Whisperer is going to generate that is toil, most is a boilerplate stuff, is going to improve the throughput of everyone. What about testing? Does it help in any way in test generation? Does it give ideas of test coverage? Does it generate? Yeah. What does it do in the realm of testing?
Yeah, not today. I mean, the Code Whisperer is not going to automatically, if you're writing a piece of software today, it does not automatically create your tests for you. What it can do is help you write your tests, because tests are also code. So that part is obviously there. But today, Code Whisperer doesn't here's my code base, go write a bunch of unit tests, because I hate writing unit tests, and now I'll have them. Obviously, as you can imagine, those are the kinds of areas that our customers are talking to us about. Unit test generation, code reviews, everything is sort of the developer life cycle is pretty much up for grabs for our customers. And I think what they and us are all trying to do together is figure out which are the areas where we can make an impact now, and where there's more work required, both in the underlying science and the underlying methodologies, to make it useful. I think that's the interesting part about this time is we've already established over the last, I would say, year, that coding companions like Code Whisperer are making an impact to helping developers get stuff done. The question now is, how do we take that to the next level?
Before I ask you about more the deployment side, which you have already hinted at with the calls to the API in S3 and so forth, but I'd like to elaborate a bit more, because it's probably, you just mentioned it, that the dev side of things is making a lot of progress, and it's heavily prone to be revolutionized. But what about the deployment? But before I ask you that, one thing that I don't want to miss about Code Whisperer that makes me really happy as someone involved in the SPDX project is that it behaves as a very nice and proficient and has a really high standard for the etiquette of the open source, the management of open source licensing. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'd like to elaborate on how it does this, but the code suggestions are tagged in some way with the license of the code base it has been trained on. Could you explain how that works?
Yeah. So right from the beginning of Code Whisperer, when I think from almost the initial press release fact that we wrote, as we do, when we're doing product development inside Amazon, the general idea of making sure that, because we knew our customers would be often at enterprises where they really, really care about where the software comes from. Are they violating?
The concern is that if Code Whisperer or any other, but in this case Code Whisperer, is suggesting literal chunks of code from the training dataset, will that make me, the Code Whisperer client, suitable, a target for a legal challenge for misusing the license that the training dataset is? Okay,
that's correct.
That's the challenge, right?
All these companies already, today, when developers bring in packages from wherever and are putting in code, they already have a lot of effort in, which is very manual, or in many ways, or various scanning, etc. So a lot of our customers are very aware of this problem. They spend a lot of resources on it. So it was right from the beginning, we knew that this was a problem we needed to address. So what Code Whisperer has, for those who don't know, has a reference tracker. And what the reference tracker does is, as you're writing code, it is able to identify, hey, here's a piece of code that we believe is similar or could be interpreted as being similar to a piece of open source code. It might, like you may have picked it up from some repository. So what it does is it'll tell you that and then point to the repository that it thinks it is that open source particular piece of code comes from. Then you can go and evaluate the license, decide if that's a license that your company is allowed to use, if it's okay, what, all the things that you have to do a lot of work to do to figure out, to even get to that point, it just gives it to you. And it was right from the way we even built our models and trained them, this was part of the goal. So it wasn't something that was added on. I think that's why it works as well as it does.
It does. From what I've heard, it really does. And I know that many people that appreciate and want to be a good open source citizen not only approve of it, but endorse it. And there's also another aspect about code security, right? That I'm not sure how it actually works. And I'd love you to explain to us because it does some kind of a scanning. I'm not sure if it scans the training data for known vulnerabilities or the other way around. If Code Whisperer in one of the without any filtering suggests code that may contain any kind of vulnerability, because let's remember LLMs for code or for anything are not intelligent. They're really good at predicting the next word, and they make sense, but they are not definitely human and definitely intelligent in a human way. So it's necessary to put filters but behind the output so that potentially vulnerabilities are filtered out or any other concerns. So could you describe how Code Whisperer actually helps in that sense, and in what way does it do it?
Yeah, so it doesn't take one approach. Like for good security, you need multiple approaches. So for example, you can scan for the top OWASP top 10 sort of vulnerabilities. That's one example. You have script library best practices that is trained on. It understands those. It's been trained on internal AWS security best practices and things like if you're using AWS APIs, it kind of knows what we would recommend and not recommend, like from a security perspective, like opening up your buckets to the whole world, as is a classic example. So there's some things that are part of its training and rules, some things you scan, and then you can suggest remediations to those code vulnerabilities. And I think this comes from, we've had a product for a while called Code Guru, which is not generative AI historically. It's an AI rules-based system that looks at code and scans code and tells you how to improve your code to be secure. Some of those practices is what made it into Code Whisperer, but more recently, as part of this new org, we actually combined the Code Whisperer and Code Guru teams into a single team.
Oh, nice.
And the idea is pretty simple. Like in the end, the quality of your code is very important, and quality includes security. So right now we are doing somewhat simple stuff, you could argue, where we are taking a bunch of well-tried and tested. Hey, look at, here are some well-known vulnerabilities. Are these showing up? Here's how you would never open up an S3 bucket. We can train those, or we can add rules on. Now, if you combine it with something like Code Guru, which you can apply to Code Whisperer code anyway, but if you make it just part of the, I think there's some very interesting ideas that we have there. So we've put the two teams together so they can start thinking together about how to make code generation and continue to keep it secure.
So how does the deployment side work in Code Whisperer? Is there I guess there are three types of way of interacting with AI assistants, AI companions, whatever we want to call them, which would be, requesting a code suggestion via comment, right? Which would be the most traditional way, maybe an instruction. And finally, a natural language, a plain English, in this case, plain language interface in which we treat the thing as a human that understands our language. How would deploying an application in Code Whisperer work in such fashion? Is it ready for a chat interaction and say, hey, deploy this? Hey, what is the performance of my application in Australia or in said region of AWS? I mean, can it do such nifty and detail-oriented things?
Not yet. I would. There's a bunch of interest. Again, this is an area where there's one of those areas where all I will say is watch this space. But what Code Whisperer is kind of in the middle of what you said, which is it does the way you add code in Code Whisperer is either by typing or adding in a comment, but the comment can be written in natural language.
Okay.
And it converts that into code. So I think that's the interesting part. Once the code is checked in, then of course your standard deployment practices come in. But I think we're trying a few other interesting ideas around this. So if you've ever been to the Lambda console, it has an embedded editor. We have sort of a new version of that embedded editor that we've started releasing. You can find it in the ECS console right now, maybe in a few others. I remember when ECS adopted it, because I was running ECS at the time. But the fun part of this embedded cloud editor is in the AWS console, and it's up to the service teams to pull it in. But you'll see it in many, many places in the console where it makes sense, is that it has Code Whisperer built into it. So I'm in the Lambda console, and I want to write my own Lambda function because you have an editor right there. Code Whisperer can write the whole function for you. And then you can deploy the Lambda function right there. So that's an example of where it does make that process a lot easier. And the reason we did Cloud Editor the way we've done it is we decided to the idea was, hey, we're just going to make this in some way the simple editor, the syntax highlighting, etc., but make it an embeddable widget in any AWS console. And it has Code Whisperer built in. So if you have access to Code Whisperer, it'll actually start completing your code for you. And Lambda is a great one because you're writing snippets of code, you're writing functions, and you're just deploying them right there. And it works really, really well for that use case.
And I can only see Code Whisperer excelling at GitOps like declarative models, right? In which your system, and this is something that some of your products actually support, I know for a fact. If your whole system is using Kubernetes, for example, and it's described in a declarative way in code, in a Git repo or in any kind of repo, then interacting with the whole system through Code Whisperer must be actually something kind of easy, right?
I don't know if it's easy yet. I think the part that we are all still figuring out, I mean, it works. It works quite well. It does make it easier. I think it actually today works easier in a serverless world where you don't even have to think about anything. You just sort of do it inline.
Yeah.
But I think the part you're poking at, which is super interesting and asking about, is I actually think some of the ways we interact with code are going to evolve because the AI is going to do so much of it for you, or it's going to do, assembling some of these things, putting them in place, telling you what, sort of almost anticipating your next step and making it a lot more seamless is going to be a lot easier. In the end, once you have an end-to-end deployment pipeline, the important part is checking in the code. So if you can get much faster at checking in the code, you are making the pipelines a lot much faster. Now, some of the things we talked about earlier on testing and reviews, etc., come in, as those also get incorporated, you're again finding the next place to make that automation that much better. So I think those are the areas where you will see the most impact. But right now, I think the biggest impact is you've already invested in automation and pipelines. The fact that you're checking in code much faster and at a much higher throughput is the part that's going to make a significant impact. And we see that, right? A good example is there's this customer called Persistent Systems. They're a services company. And they've made Code Whisperer available to, I think there are over 16,000 developers, to all of them.
Oh, wow.
Because the general idea is that's how you're working on code and checking it in. So that's a great example of sort of broad adoption and the impact it can have.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I mean, and this is a claim that I believe your CEO has made in an interview, but definitely your website makes, that is, you've apparently run an internal survey test, benchmark, bakeoff, in which you claim that the teams or using Code Whisperer will increase, at least in this test, productivity in 57%. If I'm remembering the figure correctly, it's a quite bold claim, and I'm intrigued. We were discussing before the recording that there's no one size fits all for measuring productivity, but you were hinting right now to a few items like measuring throughput and commits and check-ins, and review time cycle, all those things. So I guess, does AWS for your own internal teams has any kind of framework to measure not only productivity, by the way, but and you were also hinting in this direction before, also in terms of developer experience, right? And making the experience something pleasurable and reducing attrition and all these things. Does AWS have a framework for that? And yeah, so in what way have you come up with this astonishing figure?
Yeah, so we do have a framework, and it's evolved quite a bit since those measurements were taken in some ways, because we have a much better insight into how people are using it. The interfaces they're using it have evolved as well. I think a great example of this, and I don't have a number. I don't have a number to share, but at the New York Summit, we added Code Whisperer to Glue notebooks. So these are writing ETL pipelines using Code Whisperer. It's a very simple constrained use case, which, by the way, is similar to your declarative kind of example earlier.
But that was a month ago, right? Because the meeting in New York was...
Yeah, just a little 3 weeks ago. Time flies these days. 3 weeks, 4 weeks ago.
Yeah, but it was yesterday.
But yeah, the rate of adoption of using Code Whisperer for these pipelines is kind of astonishing. I'm waiting for us to talk about it, like the numbers in more quantitative terms. But I'm also not surprised, because that's the kind of problem that's really well served by something like Code Whisperer. But going back to your original question, the specific numbers we shared were that Code Whisperer was, helping developers complete tasks an average of 57% faster, and developers who were using Code Whisperer were 27 more likely to complete a coding task successfully than those who did it. And it was basically right around the time we launched, we took a bunch of builders and gave them a set of tasks, and we measured and we did some measurements on those. And the way to think about developing a task faster is not just about how much code you can write, how fast you're typing, and how much Code Whisperer is completing for you. If you're writing anything and the kinds of applications that people write, you spend your time looking up documentation, seeing what an API does, what its methods do, what its responses are. Code Whisperer in particular, in this case, the tasks were, AWS friendly, is very good at the AWS API. The classic example I like using is, create an S3 bucket which has XYZ characteristics, or, you're putting an object in it. Or the thing I always ask Code Whisperer to write when the first time I ever tested it was, write a function for me that increments the count every time I add an object to an S3 bucket, or something like that. Things like that get much easier, and you don't have to look up any documentation.
Yeah,
and the time adds up, and so that's where you get these task average. It's not just the time on keyboard; it's wall time, right? And wall time includes things like looking at documentation, and coding companions make that process much more clean and much faster. You're also less likely to get frustrated and leave, which is sort of
exactly more delightful.
Yeah. I can't find the documentation I'm looking for. I can't figure it out here. It tells you.
Yeah, because I can see that in the current era in which interest rates are really high, justifying budget and OPEX increases for your team, for your business unit is way tougher than it was 2 years ago. So, and at the same time, the goals of the company, especially in our sector in software, are incredibly demanding. Those have not gone down. They were already high. That puts a lot of pressure on developers, right? And attrition is a concern, right? And the developers make good money. I think it's in general a good, well-paid function. But yeah, attrition has grown, and making software delivery, the software engineering, the software experience, much less frustrated and even delightful, and discovering new things about it is the most positive thing about Gen AI for software delivery, I think, for app delivery, don't you think?
Yeah, and I look, in the end with Gen AI, making things delightful is one of the core goals. Making organizations more productive is, of course, the end goal we all have as AWS. Or, we want you to be much more productive. We've always liked to make our customers more agile. Like, this is the reason why people started using EC2 back in the day. I started using the cloud was agility more than anything else. And the definition and our expectations of agility are only going to change over time. We are where we are. We've done a lot. And now we have this new, that's why it excites me so much, is I think you can get that step change in agility and delight in ways that, we were, I like making, I ran containers for a long time, but I also like making fun of the container world, which is, I think we added a lot of complexity into the process and made it less delightful, even though we were being able to accomplish a lot more because of the automation that you could build. But I think it did add a lot of, I won't call it pain, but a lot more overhead to getting things done. And now we have this Gen AI thing, which is already shown, like sort of in its infancy, how much fun it can be, but also how much it can make your life easier. And that's, and sort of getting that flywheel rolling and seeing, which is where we are right now. Our customers are telling us what they want next. So we are cranking on that flywheel, and you'll start seeing, it's some of the work that's come out in the space in general, things like Bedrock Agents, Code Whisperer, and the enhancements that you've seen there are sort of the early signs of how that flywheel is starting to move. But if in the end, our goal is very simple. We want you to do a lot more than you're doing today, without having to invest in necessarily, oodles of. Look, it takes work to get that much more effective, and generative AI makes you very effective and makes your best people more effective as well, because they're spending their time on the highest value things. And I think that's the part that gets us all super excited.
Yeah, it's going to reduce cognitive load. It's already done it. Complexity, and for cloud native, which I think is more complex, like you just said, but also the way to go. I mean, depends if you're running a system that only requires absolute throughput, then keep it in a mainframe if you wish and isolate it, and that's okay. But if you're a customer-driven organization that needs to move fast in a highly competitive world, you most likely would like to have a systems-oriented microservices or architecture that is cloud native in a way. But in that sense, like Code Whisperer and others, is just making it more delightful. I guess. What are what should we? You've already just mentioned a few products, but what should we expect from AWS in this sense? So you've described the present now. It's limited, exciting, being iterated with your clients as you just described, a few of them quite fast as of now. But what in the near future is, I mean, no scoops, no announcements, but in general, what should we expect from AWS in this specific area?
Yeah, I'll go back a little bit and give you sort of a slightly broader picture, because I think it helps. In general, we look at AI in sort of layers of the stack, as it were, and generative AI in particular. Your lowest layer is things like inferentia and Trainium, the silicon, because being able to do a lot of training and a lot of inference at a lower cost, at more efficiently, is going to be actually really, really important. The hardest part about LLMs in general is that it takes a lot of resources to get them trained. It takes a lot of resources to do inference. So there's a lot that we are doing to optimize the lowest layer of the stack. AWS is really good at it. We've learned a lot with Graviton and some of the other things that we've done with our network, with the super clusters that we're building. So I think that's one part. The second part is what I would call the stack that are the services that are used to build AI applications. My org is a customer of all these services. So these are things like Bedrock agents that allow application developers to use AI to, LLMs. In fact, in many ways, one of the beauties of generative AI is AI, like especially deep learning, was very data centric. It was useful for data scientists, but not necessarily as much for app builders. And generative AI is, sure, data is always critical, and it allows you to do more with your data. But in the end, generative AI makes AI something for builders, which is what makes me excited, which is that third layer. Having all these tools underneath you, having the Bedrocks of the world, having the Bedrock agents of the world, what can we start building? How can we fine-tune these models for specific applications? How can we do RAG to make sure that we are getting the latest and greatest APIs represented? And that allows us to build higher level systems like Code Whisperer, like many others that you can imagine the kinds of things that we're working on. I also talked about sort of low-code, no-code application building. There's the fun part about generative AI is it's not just text, it's multimodal. So there's a lot of interesting applications. You've probably seen some of the ones in the creative side already. So I think the future that lies is as all these layers of the stack evolve, as the silicon gets better, as this middle services to build AI systems get better, you have access to more models, the ability to fine-tune them, methodology to sort of do very, very custom things. Then you can start giving more value on top. And a lot of our efforts are around what have we learned with Code Whisperer around what people want to do with code, the feedback we're getting. But code's only one part of this whole developer experience challenge. For example, we also brought in the Code Catalyst team and the Amplify team into this organization. We have lots of ideas around how to enable end-to-end delivery and web application development. So I think that's making the most of,
I was thinking right now, the only thing that maybe Code Whisperer or any other code AI assistant for software delivery is not well designed for is helping with prompt generation. I mean, are they able to tell you, you're asking me something the wrong way? This is the way you should be structuring your, or maybe you have a code companion for prompt generation and a separate that helps you with the prompt generation, and then Code Whisperer receives the input and generates the output. I'm not sure. I could be completely wrong.
Yeah, this is personal opinion that I'm going to say now, which is, I think there's a lot of people who ask me the question, are software engineers, is prompt engineering a new discipline? And I will say the answer is no. I think it is a discipline that software engineers will become good at because it's just another tool in their toolkit, is how to write prompts, and they will teach themselves. I've seen the teams in my organization, the engineers we have, become really, really good at prompt engineering. I'll also add that I think in the end, for the average developer, it may not matter, because if you're really good at if you're able to express yourself in natural language, the systems, this middle tiers, will be able to translate that into prompts and convert that into meaningful things. And sure, there'll be a small class of people who want to go in and edit prompts and be prompt ninjas. That's what I think what we'll end up being in our end. But for the average developer, I don't think it'll be something they need to think about in the fullness of time. I think in the near term, it is a skill that a lot of developers are going to pick up because they're the ones building the higher level applications. But if you're working a little higher up the stack, you're probably talking in natural language. You're probably clicking and dragging, and the prompts are underneath. And how good you are if you're really good at converting natural language into a really high quality prompt, that's actually part of the problem that you're trying to solve for your customers. So I think the way we look at it is taking the customer view, is what can we do to make customers' lives easier? And if the answer, and this is where the personal opinion comes in, a potential answer is they don't need to become experts at prompt engineering, and we become on their behalf, because the smaller number of people can then make them a larger number of people more productive. I think that's something that I personally believe, and I think I think there's reason, and there's enough data from talking to our customers where I think that has some legs.
Well, Deepak, that has been really interesting. I can only assume that if Reinvent later this year and the end of this year, somewhere around, it's always in December, correct? Right?
It's always the week after Thanksgiving.
Exactly. I'm not American. I always forget that that's a cornerstone of American life cycle in general, and
food, that's as far as I understand it.
Exactly. That's a good way of thinking. I need to have a good Thanksgiving menu once in my life, and I will never forget when it happens and what it's all about, because food anchors everything in one's memory better than the other thing. Maybe True. Love is the only other thing that sticks with more strength to our memories. So I'll presume there's going to be a lot from your team in that event, and maybe trickling out before and after. So I can only just be quite excited about hearing about those things in a few months. And yeah, other than that, I would like to thank you for your time here and wish you the best, because as you said, you're in a very critical point in time in a good way. And I think AWS is definitely well placed for many, many reasons that you explained to deliver a solid developer experience, actually, in general.
Yeah, no, it's super exciting. I said, watch this space. Andy has said that every team at Amazon, almost every team at Amazon is doing something with generative AI. There's a ton going on. I haven't been this excited in years, and I tend to get excited about tech in general. So it's a great time to be around such a foundational game-changing tech. And what makes me excited is getting into the hands of all our customers, and in the coming weeks and months, you'll see a ton. I'd love to get feedback from them. And thank you for your time. I enjoyed this too.
My pleasure. Looking forward to those. Take care.
Ciao.